Hello, everybody. How's it going? Yeah, thanks for having me. I know that organizing Meetup, I help organize one in Ottawa called Refresh Ottawa, and trying to find speakers, trying to find sponsors, trying to find venues is always a hassle, so thank you. So, everybody can clap, that's nice. There we go. So I am here to turn on my thing so that works. There, I've done that. I'm also here to talk about CSS as a mess. I've been a web developer now, surprisingly for like 20 years, which is kind of crazy that our industry's even been around that long. I mean, CSS really only for maybe 15 years. And it was interesting. So my career kind of started off doing a lot of freelance, working for agencies where every project was a little bit different, and where I was usually pretty much the only developer on it. Get a project, work on it, and deliver it. And it wasn't until I actually got a job at Yahoo, working on Yahoo Mail, Messenger Calendar, and realizing that a lot of the stuff that I did didn't really work at scale. So in that time, I came across this tweet saying that observing that the maximum number of people who can productively simultaneously work on CSS is 1. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, for me, that was my experience because I was usually the only person having to work on the CSS. So at Yahoo, kind of realizing that maybe this process could change, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And the thing is that a lot of people have this concept that CSS is easy, right? It's pretty straightforward. You take a basic HTML, you throw some CSS at it, and suddenly you have a website, right? Because CSS as a language is pretty straightforward. You have selectors. They select HTML elements. So once I've selected an HTML element, I give it some properties, and then I get stuff that might start to look like this. Some of you might like this kind of stuff. For me, this scares me. This feels like an abstraction of inline styles because I didn't want to put display block into a style attribute in my HTML. So what I'm going to do instead is that I'm going to create a block class to do that for me. And I'm just going to do, bang important so that I know that it's going to beat anything else anywhere that I've ever written in my CSS for this to work. And I'll just create a bunch of these kind of utilities that I can mix in and put together. The thing is that a lot of people like this approach. You can check out this URL, snk.ms/21. If you're wondering what snk.ms stands for, my last name is Snook, so if you could kind of sound Snookums, if you were curious. Thank you. And it's an article on Smashing Magazine. Smashing Magazine had actually a fellow coworker from Yahoo put together this article, and the projects they were doing with his team took this approach where these kind of M10 FL start, these sort of to me cryptic class names that don't really describe necessarily what they do, that you have to kind of learn what's going on, and again that you can just kind of pull these things together and throw them so it's kind of like a recipe, right? Let me grab all these little ingredients and I'll try to mix them together to get something on the page. Another example, I grabbed this one from the Drupal website where they've essentially duplicated the code for each individual piece. And in some ways that can be looked at as a good thing in the sense that I can modify my header CSS and it won't break any other navigation. But there's also a lot of duplication in this, right? The same pattern over and over again, and they're having to essentially copy and paste that code. If you can imagine creating a new component and then copying and pasting that would be a little repetitive. Trying to update the look and feel of an entire site with this approach would be time consuming. So how can we sort of identify these types of things? This one was from MySpace. And you can, when looking at this, you can kind of get a sense of what that HTML looks like, right? You can see that, well, okay, there's a link inside of probably a div, probably inside of a div, probably inside of a div, inside of a div, inside of a div, inside of a div. Right? You can see this whole structure of HTML. that has to exist for this to work. If it doesn't have these class names in that particular order, this thing will break. So I don't really have that kind of portability that I might want with this. And the interesting thing is that what did we actually care about? If this was our project, the thing that we care about is this thing at the end. We cared about what the status bar looked like. We cared about what the link in that status looked like. This is probably a separator, what that separator looks like. A lot of this extra stuff is very extraneous. Now, I'm certainly not one without blame. I took this from my own website, my website that I coded before I started at Yahoo, and admittedly still exists like that today. I haven't had to worry about updating my own website look and feel. I probably should. It's been 5 years. But again, the only thing that I cared about was the author name and the comment number. One, how many authors did I have on my own website that I needed to be so specific with my CSS that I needed to put that it was in a meta section, in a comment section, in a comment section, right? Again, the only thing that I cared about was what the author name looked like, and I cared about what the comment number looked like. So I started at Shopify 3 years ago now, and when I came in, this was their CSS. This isn't a compiled version. This is the single CSS file as it existed when I came in. And sometimes updating that file meant like trying to find the place that I needed to go and making a change and realizing, oops, I kind of broke something somewhere else. And so okay, what can I change? Where do I need to go to fix everything? Taking time to just understand the code base every time I needed to edit something became really frustrating. I kind of want to get rid of these things. This, after 3 years, is the way our CSS looks now. That before, and I will point out, we used Sass. That was the pre-Sass, even using a pre-compiler, we had this massive file that was hard to understand. And in that time, we've taken into modularizing things, pulling them out into individual pieces to make it easier for us to understand and for us to build. So a lot easier to understand. So how did we get there? How did we go from something that was just sort of this massive sprawling style sheet into something that was a lot more manageable, this system of components that anybody can use? Did we just torch everything, this sort of greenfield? Unfortunately, no. When I started at Yahoo, it was great. It was a wonderful situation, and with a lot of client projects, you come in, we want to redesign everything, and you get to start everything from scratch. That is a wonderful place to be, not having to deal with legacy code. When I started at Yahoo, they were redesigning Yahoo Mail. It was kind of interesting. I didn't realize this before starting, but they had what they called Mail Classic, which was sort of a traditional web page model. You click on a link, it does a full page refresh. You scroll, it scrolls the entire page. And at one point they decided to redesign this to create sort of an app, desktop app kind of feel, different panes that you can scroll, but it was very JavaScript heavy and the performance was just horrible, such that only 50% of their user base migrated over to the new version, and the other 50% said, we will never do that ever. And so they were suddenly stuck in this situation where half the users were on one and half the users were on another. And that was, to maintain two separate mail products is not a great idea. So their great idea was to actually come up with a third mail product, which is where I came in. So the goal of this process was to migrate, and thankfully we actually did it. We migrated everybody off those old two to a new one. But as a result of building everything from scratch, keeping performance in mind, we were able to do some cool stuff. But at Shopify, we weren't able to do that. We have a code base that admittedly still, even 3 years later, still has a few legacy pieces from even before I started. But for the most part, we're pretty close to having a wonderful system, and it has taken us a while to get there. So one of the first things that we needed to do was establish naming convention. So the reason for that is because naming convention clarifies intent. Whenever you write a selector and you're selecting these HTML elements, there's usually a purpose for it. And a naming convention, what class names or IDs do you come up with that communicate to either the future you or to any other developer that comes into the project to understand what it is you were trying to do with that. So, classes or IDs, I'm going to touch on this one thing very quickly, which is use class over IDs. Why is that? Let's talk about it. So if we look at our specificity chart, we essentially have 4 different categories of specificity. On one end, we have element selectors, which are handy. We can say all paragraphs should look like this, all headings should look like that. Our forms, like basically your CSS reset is this. Styling an entire website using only element selectors, probably not very practical. Possible, but not practical. If you've got a site that is constantly changing and you're trying to do div, nth child 2, and that element is going to look a certain way, and then you rearrange your HTML and wonder why things broke, it's going to be really hard to pinpoint why that is. But on the other hand, inline styles are things we tend to want to avoid because it doesn't allow us to reuse things and just harder to understand what our code's trying to do. So we're left with class and ID. Now, the thing is that, actually maybe an example would probably be best. So let's say I have links. These links are by default blue. But in some cases, I want to have subdued links. In other words, I don't want to draw attention to them. I still want them to be there. People need to be able to interact with some of these things. Like if you can imagine a main content area where the links are blue, but maybe the stuff in the sidebar, I don't want to draw people's attention to it. It's there. If they care to click on it, they can. So I'm going to make those links gray. Pretty straightforward. But in my site, I have this form. And this form, you want to click next, but there's a cancel link. And we're going to make this link red. Now, there's only one cancel link. And because there's only one cancel link, I'm going to give it an ID of cancel. That's pretty straightforward. So if I go into my HTML, that link will be blue. My subdued links will be gray. And my cancel links will be red. Awesome. All done. Except, how clients are. They come back and suddenly say, yeah, but we have this one particular form where we don't want to scare people off. The red links is kind of danger, and we really need them to complete, let's say, the sign up. So in this particular case, can we actually use the subdued class? So we have it. We can make it gray. The cancel link can still be there. It can still do everything that we need it to do. And so you say, of course, sure, I've got that cancel link, and I'm going to give it a subdued class. Any of you familiar with specificity might kind of understand what's going to go on here. Because of specificity, the ID is going to outrank the class selector. And in that case, this subdued link is red. That's not what we want. We're trying to give it this thing, and instead of being red, it's all of these styles are competing essentially to style this one thing, and we're getting the wrong thing. So, on Monday, you might want to take that challenge, but on Friday, you know what? Bang important all the things. So let's do that. Excellent. I've solved my problem. I can go home. I'm done. But this is kind of a path where we start to go down where we kind of add in all these exceptions, and maybe the next time I want to do something else that I don't want it to be subdued, I want to be something else, but it's got the subdued class, I start throwing in more styles in order to get to what I want. So if we tried to not go with the bang important, what other solution could we come up with? Well, so since we're trying to avoid the bang important, we could just double up on our selectors. I can do bang cancel dot subdued. Again, because of specificity, I can take a single ID selector and a single class selector, and when I combine them together, they will outrank a single ID selector. So this works. But you can see that I'm just adding a lot more CSS to try to accomplish the same thing here. And this is actually a really easy problem to solve, and that is to create two classes. One is a subdued class, one is a cancel class. Because from a CSS perspective, CSS actually doesn't care whether or not you only have one on the page or not. From a JavaScript perspective, you might care. You might need the ID as an anchor on the page. JavaScript might need to come in and change some state on you. And so that ID can still exist, but from a CSS perspective, it doesn't care. And the problem is that the moment that you use an ID selector, you've boxed yourself in. You've made it a lot more difficult. So what I can do is, yes, in my HTML, I have to have both the ID and the class, but again, the ID is for other stuff. From a CSS perspective, we just want to classify this in a particular way. And so as a result of that, I can say that this cancel link is subdued. I don't have to compete in order to style this one particular element. Now, to get back to the subject of naming convention, which was the whole point of this particular section, being able to kind of identify this component, this thing that I want to style, and give it a name. So I might have buttons. If you want to be verbose and actually use B-U-T-T-O-N, that's fine. Sometimes I like to truncate things as long as I still understand them. But then I might have large buttons. I might have small buttons. I might have like default buttons. So if you have a modal dialog and the default button in that modal dialog has a certain look and feel. You might have search buttons. In this case with Yahoo Mail, we had like this yellow search button that was different from everything else. And this is where the default button style has a certain look and feel. Maybe it has a certain border radius, certain font size, a certain padding, drop shadow, all those sort of different things that defines my default thing. And then I want to be able to define the variations. What has changed? So with a large button, maybe I just bump up the font size, or maybe I bump up the font size and the padding. So just what are those things that are a little bit different? Same thing with small. Maybe I just need to use a smaller text size. With the default, maybe there's a different focus ring, or it's blue instead of red. And so I'm just defining what those variations are. But each one starts with the same module name. So if the module is .button, then I have .button hyphen large, .button hyphen small. And as a result of that, when I go into my CSS or into my HTML, if I'm JavaScript, if I have to add classes using JavaScript, I know exactly what it is. I know that it's a button. I might know that it's a large button and where to find that in my CSS. Now, I might have modals. And with those modals, I might have large modals. I might have components of that modal, like a header. So I have that surrounding modal element, but inside that, I have a header, I've got a body, and I've got a footer. I've got these other components. And again, what I want to be able to do is identify that those elements are related to that surrounding element. And so again, I do that by prefixing them all the same. So again, the sort of base of that module, in this case the modal, and then I just repeat that every single time. Now probably the biggest question that I always get from this is, why don't I just do .button.large? I mean, in the CSS, I can still see that these things are related, .button.large. I'm using 2 class selectors instead of 1, so specificity, this will win out. If I'm looking in my HTML, I will see button space large, right? Like in pretty much all the places that I care about, this looks like this would work, and I don't have to prefix it every single time with .button hyphen large. The thing is that we can have multiple large things. How many of you use a CSS preprocessor like Sass, Less, Stylus? Most of you. It's interesting. 3 years ago when I'd ask that question, I'd get like maybe 3 people put up their hand. It's interesting how dramatically I think our industry has changed in only 3 years. And if you can imagine, actually before I get into that, so we have .button.large, .field, like if you're trying to look in your code base and you kind of understand, you know what, we probably don't need large buttons anymore, can we just get rid of those? You're like, sure, let me just search my entire code base and see if I can find every large button. But we get things like, oh, some people did button space large, some people did like large space button, some people might have button default large. So trying to, like, what's your regex that you're gonna have to type to actually make sure that you're finding every occurrence of a large button becomes a little bit more difficult. You can't just search for large, so that's a little problematic. There was a presentation at CSSConf, snk.ms/20 if you want to check out that presentation. Pamela Fox was talking about how at the company she was working for, they actually had to migrate from one version of Bootstrap to another. And in doing that, the naming convention had changed from one version to the next, and it needed to find all the occurrences of these class names. So they would do a search for like alert. You can imagine all the JavaScript alerts that might have been in there, or depending on the back-end code, things like labels, all the HTML label elements that could be found, success, info, 1,153 occurrences of info. Being able to identify what they actually cared about was very difficult, and it became a very time-consuming process to try to figure out what was being used, what wasn't being used, and updating that throughout their entire code base. With nesting, with preprocessors, yeah, I can do, ampersand.large, that works using SAS 3.3. But I don't know about you, but if you're using something like GitHub and you go to a pull request, it'll show you the 3 lines before and the 3 lines after. And suddenly with nesting, it's a little bit harder to understand exactly what you're trying to find. I actually ran into a similar problem where when I first got into Shopify, I needed to update the loading spinner. We had a little spinner that would go whenever the page was loading. And I just needed to tweak the position because it was a little offset for whatever reason, and I need to fix it. So I inspected the HTML in the browser, and it had a class of loading on it. Oh, that's easy. Let me just search my CSS for the loading class, and I found 2 occurrences. I'm like, well, that's kind of odd. And now you can imagine that huge sprawling file that we had, and all the nesting that we had done. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, why do we have 2 different loading classes? And after about 10 minutes, I discovered that we have 2 different loading classes that do 2 different things depending on what element it's actually placed on. So the loading class added to the loading header does the spinner. The loading class added to the content actually shows or hides the loading page. So one was essentially kind of defining the state, like my page is loading. Can you add this here? And then when that happens, you'd actually see the loading header with the word loading and the little spinner. And so it became this situation where it was really difficult to understand exactly what was happening in the right place. And yeah, okay, it only took me 10 minutes, but it took me 10 minutes. Those times of trying to track down and understand what my code base is doing add up for something that should have taken me 2 seconds, right? I should have been able to look at one place in my CSS and known exactly what was happening. So problem is really easy to solve. .button hyphen large. And in my CSS, I don't even need to nest, right? As great as nesting might be for a lot of you, I tend to avoid nesting with a preprocessor, and I'll just have .button, and then I'll have .button hyphen large. Very straightforward. And so, I was talking about things like states, being able to identify, in this case, that JavaScript was coming in and modifying stuff on that page. In that case, what I will do is actually include the is. So is hyphen button hyphen active. So I still have the module name, so I can see the button across all of these, but I've added an extra little bit to that naming convention. Again, what this does is it clarifies intent. There was an interesting article by Harry Roberts. He has a website called CSS Wizardry, and in it he talks about namespacing. So he has a whole bunch of different namespaces that he uses. I don't tend to go quite that far. I usually only have about maybe 2 to 3 different kinds of prefixes that I'll have for different reasons. So states is one of them. Theming is another. I might use stuff for like typography, but I also use it for things like versioning. So with Shopify, sometimes we can't just roll out an entire change all at once. Good example of that was our input fields. Shopify admin is very data intensive, data entry. So we have a ton of forms, like literally thousands of form elements across our page, checkboxes, radio buttons, inputs, text areas. There's a lot of inputs in our application. And if you can imagine the pull request to update every single page to identify or change the HTML structure, because we decided to get a little bit fancy, and so we had to change the HTML structure around every single input. Changing every single page was a monumental task. So what we did is we had the old input styles, and then we created a new version. And so we needed to be able to identify that new version separate from everything else. And again, we did that with naming convention. We added an extra bit to the beginning that said, in our case, we came up with the next prefix, which, okay, admittedly probably wasn't the best. Naming things is hard. Interestingly enough, these are probably the longest, hardest fought discussions that we have in our company is all about naming things, which maybe in some ways is a little frightening. So when I started coming up with the idea of a naming convention, this was the naming convention that I had come up with for states. Is button active? Which admittedly is kind of like asking a question, like, is it active? So we've actually changed it a little bit now at Shopify, where we do button is active. Again, the is still there. And for those that like things to line up, having button line up at the end there is kind of nice too. Anyway, so this naming convention that when I first wrote about it, this was the process that I used. I had a module name, no hyphens, and that's how you identify what the root node is. Like this is the root of my module. If I see an HTML element with a class name that doesn't have a hyphen, I know that's where this module starts. This is the root of this thing. And then if I had a variation of that, so let's say button large, so I've got BTN and a space BTN hyphen large. They're on the same element. I know that's a variation, this different style of a particular element. And so I would use the hyphen to be able to identify that. Now, if I came across another element that had, let's say, in the case of the modal hyphen header, because I didn't have that base modal class on there, I knew I could look up the DOM tree until I found it. In this case, my DOM tree was usually fairly compact, so I'd look up one element. Hey, there's the modal. So I'd see modal, and then I would see modal hyphen header. And that was how I identified subcomponents. But from a naming, like just glancing at this, you can't really tell the difference between a subcomponent and a submodule. So a lot of people have adopted BEM. How many of you are familiar with BEM? A few hands. BEM is a CSS approach very similar to the approach that I had come up with, where they have three components. One is called a block, one is called an element, and one is called the modifier. So the block it's an HTML element. This is a new piece. So it might be a button, it might be a modal, and that's where that thing starts. An element is this child element of that particular block. And then the modifier is like a variation, right? This submodule, this like the button large. So the button large is the modifier. And the naming convention that they have is by using hyphens or underscores. This is actually a particular variation. I find actually researching anything on BEM is a little confusing because people have kind of adopted things and call it BEM even when it's not exactly BEM. So BEM inspired, I guess, is a good way to describe it. And in this case, the submodule uses double hyphens and the subcomponent uses double underscores. So now you can actually tell the difference between these two. And that actually means using double hyphens or double underscores, you can now actually use hyphens to separate words in the module name. I find this really noisy. I guess maybe my designer sensibility doesn't like that many horizontal lines for some reason. So this is like kind of the approach that I prefer. If I need to separate between the module and or the submodule and the subcomponent, I'll use a single hyphen or a double hyphen. And then if I really cared about separating words in my class in the root module, then I'll just use camel case. I like this. This is a little bit cleaner. I know some people that use this approach. But ultimately, at the end of the day, pick a system that works for you and your team. At Shopify, we ended up actually taking a BEM approach. So we use the double hyphens and the double underscores. As much as I don't really care for it, I'm not going to rage against the machine and do something completely separate. And it's important to be consistent, right? Anybody coming into your project, once they kind of understand your naming convention, need to know that that's going to be the naming convention across the board. So as long as you've picked one, be consistent. But just recognize that there are these sort of three things that you are trying to identify. The one is that root node. Where does my module start? The second thing being module variations or submodules. And the third thing being these subcomponents, these child elements of this particular module. So as long as you've identified those three things, pick whatever naming convention that you want to use. Now, another concept that we try to take is to, anytime we build something, is have our CSS and HTML do one thing and one thing only. And this is actually a surprisingly difficult thing to do. There is a number of things that kind of fight against our ability to do that. So for example, hey, I've got a button in a modal dialog. I want to style this thing very specific to that. Or I have a bunch of cards, let's say, that I want to lay them out in a very specific way. And so I just want to be able to kind of combine these classes together. For anybody familiar with OOCSS, it's another approach to CSS development. And it tends to go down that path of separating things into different categories and then mixing these things together on a given element. Harry Roberts and a lot of the stuff that he talks about does just that. So even though it takes a sort of block element modifier approach to something, it's about taking the naming convention but then mixing these things together to build something. Whereas with a lot of the stuff that we do at Shopify, the stuff that we did at Yahoo, was actually about identifying this piece, this component, and then isolating it away from everything else. And there was a lot of reasons for that. So to kind of give an example of this, if I did have a card, for example, but I wanted to display this in a grid, I might try to combine that card with the grid column that sits within this sort of list of elements. But the problem is that there are properties of the card and properties of the grid, in this case the grid column, but possibly the grid itself, that could be competing. That I might have to override one set of styles with another. And as a result of that, in order to fix this, I need to figure out, okay, well, which styles should win? If I'm doing this and I'm like, my card is great by itself, but the moment I throw it with the grid column, it breaks. Okay, well, we don't want that. So then I start throwing like bang important on stuff. And if we're looking at the CSS for this, I've identified this grid column and I say, after every second element, I'm going to clear the float. So I just kind of have these like two items all the way down. And then my cards by default are just displayed inline blocks. So kind of like an image, I just need to keep them in a given place. So if I'm trying to separate these things, it's actually relatively easy. I just create a separate HTML element for that card. So that card now sits alone. I'm not combining a bunch of different things onto the same element. And sometimes that can be a lot more subtle to see and identify. If I'm looking at this code, for example, I might look at that card and go, why, yes, of course. It is a module all by itself. It's got a single class on its own. But there's a couple telltale things here. One, you'll notice that the card is now on a list item. If you can imagine just taking that out and just putting a list item by itself, it's probably not going to work. A list item generally needs to be within a UL or an OL, right, with an unordered or ordered list. And so that's one thing. But if we look at our CSS as well, you'll notice the similarity of this code to what I had before. But instead of having the grid column that I've identified, I just used a child selector. And I said, you know what, all list items are going to be styled a particular way. Again, that list item is taking sort of a layout role. It's trying to create this grid layout. And as a result of that, I'm back into the same situation I was before, where both are potentially competing on the same element. And again, that separation is really easy to do. I just put it on its own div. I have the list item, I have the UL. So I still have all the components of what I was looking for. And the great thing about this grid system is that I can templatize this. I can essentially put any item in here, whether it's a card, whether it is a bunch of images. Maybe I want a carousel, a grid of carousels, because we love carousels so much. I can do that, and I know that the grid, I can take that grid separately and I can test it on its own. All the CSS for that is going to be in one place, in my grid CSS file, right? Because when it comes to testing, the process that we've normally taken as an industry is, let me take my entire CSS, pull it all together, and then open up the page. And if I have a 20-page site, I check every single page to see if anything broke. Any CSS change I make, I now have to check every single page. You take educated guesses. I probably only affected this one page. Nothing looks broken, I'm probably okay. But of course, with complex growing systems, we inevitably run into these edge cases. Oh yeah, that particular page only happens when you're onboarding, so I wasn't able to see that, because once you've finished onboarding, then everything looks great. So there's all these sort of catches, and it's hard to really identify these things on their own. And then likewise for the card. It's really hard to just take that card on a list item and have that work, because list items come with its own baggage, right? Things like list styles, stuff that might have been overridden in the root UL. So with the UL, you said list style none, but then you take that LI and you bring it onto its own, suddenly that list style bullet comes back. So there's often a lot of default styles that if you wanted to test that would suddenly, okay, I've got to undo or add all this extra CSS so that I know it's going to work properly. When if you can just take that and put it into its own element, something that you know that you can isolate and keep completely separate from everything else, is a lot easier to test. So, this approach to this modularization, one of the important things I find is about that isolation. Being able to identify this design pattern in something that you're building and then keep it separated from everything else. So I'm going to go through another example. Let's say you have navigation, right? You've got a bunch of list items. This is a pretty straightforward pattern. I use this in a ton of projects. Anybody came to me with a pull request that looked like this, I'd be like, ship it. We're good to go. I've got a list, the HTML, very straightforward, no surprises. But of course, as projects evolve, let's say in this particular one, the client comes back and says, you know what, it's a lot of steps to have to go to products and then pick a product category. Can we actually have a drop down when I hover over products that shows me a list of categories? And so you say, sure, that's easy enough. Let me just throw a UL in there. I've got a menu. But the CSS that was originally written was impacting a lot more HTML than we actually wanted. So I start having to undo all that CSS that I had written. So in the case of the list items inside of other list items, I want to get rid of the floating, because instead of this horizontal nav, I now have a vertical nav, this drop down. And so I'm actually undoing something that I didn't need to do to begin with for that particular element. List items automatically stack. The padding is different, background colors might change, and I have to undo this stuff. And the solution to this is relatively straightforward, and that is to actually take advantage of things like child selectors. I'm going to assume none of you, okay, how many of you still have to worry about IE6? Oh, thank God. That would be a horrible, horrible, I would not wish that on my worst enemy. So thankfully, we're now beyond having to worry about being able to use child selectors. Every modern browser supports them. And the great thing about this is that it forces our CSS to only style the things that we care about. So instead of impacting all this other HTML that I may or may not have known was going to come, I can use the child selector to limit the impact of my CSS. And now that I've done that, this drop-down menu that is a different thing, I want to identify it as something different. So instead of calling it .nav, in this case, I'm going to call it .menu. I could have called it .dropdown. I could have come up with whatever name it was, but I want to come up with a naming convention to identify that this visual pattern is actually completely different from the one I was using before. And again, using the child selector to limit the impact that this particular dropdown might have. Now, because of the fact that this menu sits inside of this nav, what happens? Like I want to be able to hover over the list item, and I want this menu to appear. And from a CSS perspective, this looks pretty straightforward. .nav, list item hover, .menu. Now, if we're like separating our CSS, I've got my nav CSS in one place, and I've got my menu in another. Where do I put this particular code? Does it go with .menu or does it go with .nav? Hands up if you say .nav. Hands up if you say .menu. Okay, you guys aren't even playing along. Let's do that again. How many people say .nav? A few more hands. .menu? More hands for .menu. Okay. But the fact that any of you disagree means that it's going to be confusing to try to understand where to go to identify this stuff. It's also difficult to test. Like, can I just take a menu and test it by itself? Not really, right? It has to exist with the nav in order for this stuff to work. So let's try something a little bit different. So I've got this menu and I've got this nav. I'm going to take out this menu and I'm going to put in something a little bit different. I'm going to put in a nav dropdown. Now, this nav dropdown is going to be generic. So there's no real visual styles to it. It's just a container for other things. So the fun thing is that I can actually put anything in here now. And that nav dropdown is part of the nav module. It's going to exist in one place. Because of that naming convention here, the fact that I've got that nav hyphen dropdown, I know that it's part of that nav module. So I can do display block, I can do display none. That menu, by default, just has a display block style. I can take that module, put it onto its own page, and it's still going to work. I can move it into other places on my page, and it's still going to work. It doesn't have this dependency to the nav in order to change its look and feel. So you might say, well, why would I ever need to do this? So to give you an example of this, in Gadget, I don't know if they still have this design or not, but at one point they did, which, yeah, I hover over events and I have a list item, right? Pretty straightforward. But you hover over something else and they got this. So you can see where, I mean, they're both technically drop downs, right? But visually and functionally are dramatically different. And so being able to, like, if somebody came to me and said, like, sure, the CSS for this is going to do .nav, child selector li, child selector, mega dropdown, child selector, like, and links and stuff. That's just this long chain of stuff because this just happened to be over there. It's very hard to maintain, very hard to test. It's just, it becomes this massive file of stuff. And so that little technique of, you know, just creating this container that I can just put different type of content in. And that's actually something that I've recognized as sort of this really common pattern. And so, you know, as much as we can, we want to avoid styling based on context. And I see this all the time. I have these arguments at Shopify to this day where a designer's like, yeah, but it's only on this one page that we're going to do this. And I'm like, I don't care. You do not need your selectors to be that specific. And the moment you create it, another designer is going to go, hey, you know what? I would like to use that on my page. And I see that all the time. Our dashboard have these analytic numbers, so they're bigger, they're colored, and we were going through this redesign process, and so they decided to kind of reuse the style, and they created these things. Then they said, okay, because it's on the dashboard, I'm going to do .dashboard, and I'm going to say .dashboard I forget what the class name, analytics might have been the word that they came with, in order to style these sort of big numbers. Stats, I think, was actually the word they came up with. But unbeknownst to them, there was another team working on another feature on another page that showed analytics. And it was the same style. And I was like, see, like, you guys could have just used the same class name, but because you built within your own bubble and you styled things so specific to that context, we couldn't actually reuse that stuff easily. We had to refactor, in this case, both things in order to get things on the same page. So, avoiding that context, even if you're only going to use that variation in one place, chances are you're going to only use it in one place to start. And the other thing is that if you're only using it in one place and you have a design system that, hey, we have this button used in 20 different places, but we have this one button used in only one place, the question you're probably going to want to ask yourself is, well, do I really need that one special thing in that one special place? And chances are you probably don't. So being able to see this pattern, all the different variations in one place, actually makes it really easy to identify when you've got a broken system, when you've got a lot of patterns that you don't need. And that happens in a number of different things. Colors. I don't know how many shades of gray. How many shades? 50. Thank you. Our designers love gray for some reason. So they're all over the place. And it's like, well, we don't actually need that many. We've come up with a color palette for Shopify, and there is 10 grays that we should be using, which is still a lot. There's like a blue tint to the other one. Anyway, there's a lot we have a color palette, and our color palette is limited to 54 colors, and yet there is 160 unique color instances across all of Shopify. So clearly opportunities to refactor. Our font sizing. Our UI kit identifies 8 different font sizes that we should be using across Shopify. There is 40 different font sizes right now littered across our CSS. Right? These sort of opportunities that once you pull them all into one place, become really easy to identify. And there's actually a lot of really great tools for being able to identify these things. One is called CSS stats. You basically just give it a style sheet and it will go through and it will compile a list and say, here's all the font sizes that you're using. Here's all the colors that you're using. And those are really great opportunities to say, okay, we may have gone a little too far. Can we refactor and bring these things in line? And that goes for buttons and modals and all those different things that you might have in your site or application. So, if you have a modal dialog and you have these inputs inside the modal dialog, your inclination might be, well, I've got input inside a modal. I'm going to come up with this style. But recognize that input is not, yes, it's in a modal right now, but it's not part of the modal, right? The modal is that shell. So style this thing as its own thing, separate from everything else, and identify it that way. And at Shopify, so we have these drop downs. It's pretty straightforward. It's got a little fang on it and little rounded corners, a bit of a drop shadow. And this was the HTML for it. We have a drop down. We've got a list of items. Pretty straightforward. And the CSS for that, again, looks very simplistic. But it turns out we actually like drop-downs. So we have date pickers, for example. We have the filter drop-downs. We have these contact cards. And it turned out that the shell for each of these was exactly the same. When it wasn't the same, it should have been the same. In the case of contact cards, it turned out it wasn't the same. And trying to style, if I've already said that all list items should look a certain way because I expected it to be the stacked list, how do I handle this, where maybe this list of links at the top was actually a list? And then I had to add more styles in order to kind of undo the stuff that I had elsewhere to get the look and feel that I wanted. So this kind of ties in a little bit to a concept that I call depth of applicability. And this is, I want to say, similar to what the SAS team has. They have what's called the inception rule. The exception rule means don't nest more than 3 levels deep. And this is kind of similar to that in the sense that when you have an HTML structure and a CSS structure tied to that, right? This sort of intertwining of things. This depth of applicability is essentially how deep do each of these elements apply. In this case, I've got a link inside of a div, inside of a div, inside of a div, inside of a div. I've got like 5 levels deep in order to style this thing. And so, this can be subtle too. If I have just a link, comments A, again, that div out here and the link I'm trying to style may have this deep structure that still exists. That HTML still exists. And I want to try to avoid those deep structures because that's where we get this sort of difficult to manage because any of that HTML could change underneath it. So the way to affect that is to just shrink the CSS that I'm trying to style to like 1 element or 2 elements. Once I hit 3, that's generally as far as I want to go. So if we go back to that drop down that I was talking about, the drop down itself is really just the shell. And that's all I really cared about. I cared about the drop shadow, I cared about the rounded corners, I cared about the little fang, which I was probably using a pseudo element for. And the contents that go in that are something completely different. So whether or not it was the filter or it was the date picker or whether it was the contact card or whether it was an actual drop-down list of items, the drop-down itself was very simple. It was a single HTML element. The CSS is a single selector. So that depth of applicability is really about narrowing down the focus of what we're trying to build. So if I start building out a module, this piece on my page, and I start getting really deep, chances are it's actually an opportunity for you to break those things apart. At Shopify, one of the designers on the team was building out the search. And when he was building out the search, it was an input box. And when you type in the input box, a drop-down appeared. And he built this whole thing as this cohesive piece. And it was really about being able to identify, well, actually, yeah, it's all one thing in one place, but it's actually built up of all these different separate pieces. There's the input, which is going to look similar to all the other inputs we have on the site. There was the drop-down, which was going to look similar to all the drop-downs on the site. And then there was the content, the actual results, which were going to look similar to other lists throughout the site. So being able to identify those patterns in the design and breaking them down into the chunks that we cared about. And to add to that, processors do not solve architectural problems. A lot of times people have come to me and said, well, taking this modular approach isn't really that important. I can build this thing and then I can extend it. I can use mix-ins. I can use all these different approaches. But at the end of the day, they may have saved you some time, but they're probably not saving your users time. And the reason is because your CSS is probably ballooning out of control and you might not be aware of it. So I came across this lovely chart. I did not put this together. Developer efficiency chart. You can see that this person was a fan of OOCSS, which has a lot of similarities I've mentioned to the stuff that I'm talking about today. Again, they obviously clearly like Sass better than Less and Stylist. And that if you combine these two things together, you're going to be pretty okay. And then somebody decided to modify it and say, someone who actually knows how to use CSS. Yeah. So here's an example. I've got nesting here that I can just put .nav, and then inside that I can do li. That's pretty cool. But that compiles down, very straightforward. But I can get stuff like this, right? Content nav lia, where I just start nesting deeper and deeper. And you can start to see these really long selectors that start to be created. And as a result of that, we just end up generating more and more code. Sometimes nesting can be kind of handy. So for example, nesting media queries, to me, are actually really handy. These are nice features. But as a result of that, you're sticking to a particular module and you're sticking to a variation of this, these would be about the only time that I would use them. And again, you don't tend to nest media queries inside of media queries, although you can, which is kind of cool. But yeah, it just compiles down and kind of saves having to repeat the selectors. So I'm going to come up with this other example to kind of drill this point home, where it cannot sometimes not be obvious. So for example, let's say I had a module, and this module could have been like a modal dialog, and it's got a hover state. Whenever I hover over this modal dialog, it has a certain look and feel, and then maybe it has a subcomponent like the modal header, the modal body, the modal footer, and I decide that, you know what, I'm going to extend that module, right? I mean, from a development perspective, this looks really straightforward, very clean, very compact. This looks like awesome code. But when we actually compile this down, you'll notice some stuff that starts to happen. It starts doubling up on all these selectors in order to make this happen. And if you can imagine, you know, the more I start extending these sort of complex structures, our code starts growing exponentially. And the interesting thing is that the solution to this is actually really straightforward. And that's to, one, not nest, not extend, right? Just write clean, straightforward CSS. My module can still have its hover state. My submodule can change its color. The subcomponent can still have its styles. And so in this case, all the extending did, the only thing that it saved me was not having to write module here. I could have just had class equals module submodule and module subcomponent, and it saved me writing that, but it generated all of this, right? So by simplifying the CSS, it's easier to understand, especially when looking at a web inspector. I'm always scared sometimes when I look at projects that have a lot of extending, a lot of CSS resets, sort of all this code that's designed to like layer on abstraction over abstraction, and I look at the web inspector and it's just this huge scrolling mass with like lines through most things. Like, what is it? I don't know where I'm actually trying to be looking to find the stuff that I care about. So, what does all that mean? This is about shifting our thinking when it comes to how we build projects. You know, as an industry, I know certainly the way I started was about thinking about the page. A lot of the designs that I started off with had two templates, a home page and an inside page. So I would code up the home page, everything I needed to do to make that home page look okay, and then go to the inside page and code up everything that was different. And that was all there was to it. In fact, I remember blog posts of people at the time, probably around 2004, 2005, where people were like, no, what we should do instead is actually code the inside page, then do the home page. Like this was like this mind blown thing, like, oh, we should be doing it the other way around. And yet, you know, when we have these complex websites with all these different components, we have to kind of break away from this page-based mentality and instead consider the system of components, these interactions, because of all the just complexity in the stuff that we're building. A really good website to check out is on Atomic Design. Brad Frost is actually writing a book now about this. And what it does is it takes sort of the concepts of modular CSS development and brings it also to a design side of things, which I think is important. Pattern Lab is a tool that he and a bunch of other people had put together, which is a really nice tool. It's actually very similar to the sort of prototyping engine that we had built at Yahoo. And what it does is it allows you to start off with really small components. And that small component might be your color palette. It could be a single input. And then combining those things into slightly bigger things. Like I'm going to have an input with a button. And then combining those things into bigger things. Like I have a form, like let's say a contact form. The contact form has, you know, form, input, button, input, 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 like this sort of structure to it. And then that goes with templates. So you might have an inside template or a home template. And then those ultimately get stamped into actual pages. where you have the About Us page or the Contact Us page. This construction of components, which, with the stuff that we were doing at Yahoo, worked very well for us. Again, we would start with an individual component, and we would build, let's say, a small template. OK, cancel. A lot of our modal dialogues were just confirmation modal dialogues, and they had OK, cancel. And so we just had a template, and the only thing that it had in there were two buttons, an OK button and a cancel button. And then we just reused that in every single modal that had those buttons. So if we ever needed to change the look and feel, maybe the way those things are positioned, we could do it in one place and it would modify everything altogether. So this ability to then pull this piece into a modal dialogue and then take that piece and combine it into a full page. So we could take a look at something either as an entire chunk or in smaller and smaller pieces until we got down to the microcosm, the single button. And that allowed us to test and build really quickly. We, at our peak, had 5 front-end developers building out all the HTML and CSS for over 200 engineers. We built out Yahoo Mail, Messenger, Calendar, Address Book, and we did all that, admittedly, within a 2-year time span. When we started, there was just me. So I feel like that's a process that scales well, that we could test everything, that when the calendar team decided to modify something, that it didn't suddenly break Yahoo Mail, which it had on occasion. Again, one of the learning mistakes that we learned throughout that process. But the fact that we had this system that was so easy to modify now, that we could change the look and feel. They've actually gone through 2 redesigns, I think, since I've left. And each redesign process didn't take 2 years. It took 3 months. A much quicker process to go through the design and implementation as a result of that modularization. And this approach is one that has, I think, really been taking, the entire industry, I want to say by storm, but that a lot of companies are taking this modular approach. Styleguides.io is a great website of resources of other people's style guides. They kind of go by different names: Pattern Labs, Style Guides, UI Kits, whatever it is. If you follow me on Twitter, I linked up 2 today. One by GitHub and one by, who was it? Thank you, Heroku. Obviously, you guys follow me. Thank you. So yeah, just a great website with a ton of great resources, including resources on how to build your own. So there's, again, a ton of tooling out there to help you build the kind of stuff for your project. At Shopify, we have our own style guide. Unfortunately, right now, it is still manual, so every time we make a CSS change, we have to update the style guide along with it. But we're on the process of actually building our own automated style guide so that the moment we make a CSS change, our style guide automatically reflects those changes. So very useful for that as well. So 3 things I want you to walk away with. One is modularize. Using naming convention to establish that identity, this piece that is its own standalone thing. So talking about standalone, isolation, right? The ability to isolate this component separate from everything else. And then lastly, refactoring. At Shopify, it's taken us, unfortunately, years. As we build out a new part of the website, understanding, okay, what can we refactor? I think that for any kind of growing system, we can't just leave it behind. I have seen projects where people don't touch certain pages or certain parts of their code because they don't want it to break anything. I went to a conference and I had met up with this one company, and they said, yeah, they have parts of their app that just nobody has touched in years because they, at this point, don't even understand it anymore and would essentially require rebuilding it from scratch. And that's a scary place to be, right? That we're not going to touch that. If you're trying to establish consistency in the user experience across huge websites, it's important to understand that you're going to have to go through this refactoring process. So with that, I want to say thanks. You can check out the website smacks.com, which is, I just happened to write a book about this thing if you want to check it out.